for participating in this webinar where we are going to talk through workplace policy best practice approaches to domestic violence. This is a fairly new initiative at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where we are really partnering and collaborating with employers, large employers, smaller employers across the state to offer guidance and support and encouragement that they all consider inserting domestic violence specific policy into their workplace policies. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll have a better understanding of why this really is very important. My name is Karen Jarmach. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've been in this role here at CCADV for nearly a decade, a little more than 8 years at this point. Before that, I served in the House of Representatives in Connecticut and ran a community-based domestic violence organization as well in North Central Connecticut.
Hello, I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Security and Resiliency at Aetna. I have a background in the public and the private sector. I spent 26 years in federal law enforcement. I've been in the private sector now for almost 10 years, working with a couple different companies, and really my focus has been physical security. And I also have a master's degree in Homeland Security, and my capstone project was workplace violence. So thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the partnership I have with CCADV and my current role with Aetna.
Thank you, Sean. And you'll hear later on in this webinar about the work that CCADV has been able to do with Sean and his team at Aetna, with the support of Aetna, and how really this is an achievable goal for many businesses in our state. We thought first we'd talk through domestic violence in the workplace and why this is important. I've heard often the comments that domestic violence is a family issue. It's not something that work should be concerned with. And our response to that is to just give us all a moment to think on that and understand that domestic violence absolutely is a workplace issue. It can affect employees. We know statistically if 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence and men are victims as well, then the likelihood that there are individuals in your place of employment who are grappling with this problem is notable. And so we know it affects, therefore, many employees, and it can have different impacts from impairing their job performance. Individuals might be taking time off, whether it's due to the control and the power control mechanism that's happening in their life that's keeping them from getting to work on time or getting to work at all. It's very traumatic when you're a victim of domestic violence, and often victims also struggle with depression, and substance use can insert itself into this issue as well. And so we also know that there are examples where an abusive partner who is often jealous and controlling can also exert this behavior onto colleagues of the victim, wanting to insert themselves into, I don't know, Sean, if you have any examples at Aetna or thoughts around how this really is something that does affect the workplace.
When you talk about workplace violence in the business atmosphere, domestic violence is an issue that we have to deal with. It represents about 25% of the cases that we currently look at. The important piece with a business or really any organization is that the abuser knows where the victim is, usually between 9 and 5. That becomes a business problem. That becomes a security safety problem business needs to address. Take a look at it.
Well, thank you. And we know that often for victims of domestic violence, the workplace, it can be a safe haven for them. It's a place where they know they can go 9 to 5 during the week and have a predictable atmosphere for themselves. And for many victims of domestic violence, the economic impacts are huge because if they are contemplating leaving, they do need to know that they have a job and an income. And so that economic independence is extremely important. And it's also often possible for those who have abusive behaviors to use workplace resources. And I think we made reference to this earlier. I'll give an example. We worked in 2014 with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And sadly, one of their analysts, Lori Jackson, was murdered by her husband while she was an employee there. Leading up to that homicide, her husband was calling the office, calling her supervisor, making threats to her supervisor. So clearly, this is very much a concern for employers. But what we want to impart is some knowledge around how you can actually support the victim, how you can hold offenders who might be employed within your organization accountable, and really just outline a culture that is so important in today's corporate world. So just for those of you who are working either in the legal aspect of your organization or in human resources or security, we like to be able to just talk briefly about domestic violence because it is it's rather unique in that it's a pattern of abusive behavior in an intimate relationship where one individual is trying to control or dominate their partner. And it can take many forms. It can be very subliminal, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it can really escalate to very assaulting, threatening, harassing behaviors that can be fatal. And so this is a really serious problem. You know, I look back on a few years ago when there was the high-profile case of Baltimore Ravens player Ray Rice, who punched his fiance in an elevator, and his comments were that this was a mistake. He had made one mistake. And so I think what's really important to convey, and what I was thinking when I was hearing those comments, is domestic violence isn't a one-off. It is a learned behavior. It's a continual behavior. It can take one form or many forms. It can be emotional and psychological, where someone is harassing their partner, putting them down, acting in a very jealous way, trying to isolate their partner from family, friends, and colleagues at work. It can be physical, such as hitting and pushing, sexual. Financial abuse is a very large piece of this that I think employers should be aware of in terms of the abuser wanting to withhold money, control the money, and therefore that job is just so critical to the partner who is being abused. Texting and tracking someone with a GPS device, that's such an, Sean, you probably know from your world, it's such an easier thing for people to do today. And we find all of these things to be either one or two of these things or all of these things to be occurring in a relationship. You know, I was talking with a media reporter very recently who had broken up with a boyfriend, and she was asking me if I should be concerned because as they were leaving the station, which has a secure setting, he was across the street standing there, and should that be concerning to her? And so that's the stalking and harassing behavior, and yes, that should be concerning. But often for victims of domestic violence, they're just not really sure, and that's why an employer who has a heightened level of understanding and support is really important.
So we had a case, one of our field operations, and the security guard was very attuned to what was going on. And we had an employee being dropped off by her husband. And then the husband would park himself in the parking lot for most of the day. And that was observed. We finally got involved, and it wasn't just a parking violation, being on private property. It was really a husband stalking his wife, the employee. And because the security guard was aware of workplace violence and knew for the signs and symptoms to look for, we were able to get the professionals in there to kind of address the problem, employee assistance program, HR, and so forth, to help out the employee. So it's really a team effort. So it comes in many different forms, as you said.
I think that's a great example because why when we go back to the culture and the training piece on this workplace issue, domestic violence workplace issue, in that the training is so critical. So you're talking about a security guard. It can be a supervisor. It can be a colleague. It can be someone who's working on your team. And so the domestic violence is something that could yield itself in any of these settings. And so it's really just critical not just to have the policy, but also to have the practice of training or awareness within the organization. Someone who's affected, some warning signs around someone who's being affected by domestic violence can be yield themselves around productivity and then also changes in their behavior. So if a person's having frequent absences or tardiness, requesting time off, maybe the quality of their work is impacted by what's going on. And maybe you're noticing that they're on their phone a lot. Therefore, their abusive partner might be expecting they're going to be checking in continuously throughout the day or calling their office continuously throughout the day. They also might appear to be anxious, frightened, fearful. Isolation is a real tactic utilized by abusive partners, so they are not going to necessarily want their partner to be spending time with colleagues outside of the office, or who are you having lunch with? Why are you having lunch with them? Really wanting to be obsessed a little bit and focused on what's going on at work, because that's an area where they don't have control. And so they're going to think of different ways to exert that control.
And that's why it's so important to really have this team approach, because it's not simply a security problem in the business setting. It's HR, legal, employee assistance. I mean, everybody has a role in this, and it's really getting together and recognizing what the behaviors are and the symptoms, and taking that team approach to mitigate that. So it doesn't always come to security first. It might come to HR, but we try to really work together to resolve the issue.
That's a really good point. We do like to include statistics in here around Connecticut. Many of you are Connecticut employers, just to see what we're viewing across our spectrum in terms of what victims of domestic violence are experiencing the most. Clearly, it's the jealousy and the control issues, the threats. But we know that the most dangerous of circumstances can be when a domestic violence offender has access to a firearm. That increases the chance of homicide by 5 times. We also know that if there is someone who's trying to leave the relationship, that is a very, very dangerous time. And so just to have a view on that from employers, if you have someone who does seem to be a victim of domestic violence and there are these things going on, to be really keenly aware of these circumstances. When organizations have a domestic violence workplace policy, employees are more likely to feel comfortable being able to talk to a supervisor or feeling like they're not going to lose their job potentially if domestic violence is identified.
So we're going to talk about Aetna, how we put together the workplace policy. And again, this was really in partnership with CCADV and really looking at domestic violence as being one of the key components of it. When I talk about workplace violence, it's a program. Workplace violence is a fairly wide spectrum. Maybe it could be from harassment or a perceived threat all the way up to a physical assault, and then even an active shooter case would be workplace violence. So it has to be a fairly comprehensive program, and the policy needs to kind of address that large spectrum. The program really has 3 key components to it. It's prevention, intervention, and preparedness. And one of the key cornerstones of prevention is the policy. And that's really getting together with legal, HR, security, all the key stakeholders to come up with a policy that will fit the entire program. Intervention's a little bit more difficult. You identify a problem, and now how do you manage that problem? These cases are not all that simple. And again, that's where you need that team approach, where it's security has some input, HR has some input, legal, employee relations, and so forth. So that's the intervention piece. And the preparedness is, if something does happen, is the workforce prepared to handle that? And we have threat escalation guidelines, for an example. We have an active shooter preparedness plan that kind of addresses that part of it. So it's a very comprehensive approach. And again, I want to emphasize that the policy is really one of those key pieces of it. It kind of puts the ship in the right direction to be able to mitigate these problems as they come forward.
I just want to make note of the fact that when Aetna did this, I think for many employers it might feel overwhelming to try to take these steps to create policy. And we're going to talk through that. CCADV has some recommendations around tools and sample policies. And Sean, I know you're going to talk around the key components of workplace policy that you did at Aetna, but just how you all work together on that. And it is very achievable.
It is, and the reality is that because of these mass shootings and active shooter events that seem to be weekly, unfortunately, in this country, it's a topic that everybody's talking about and is aware of. It's front of mind. So it was easy to kind of get the conversation started, but I don't think many people realize how comprehensive this is, or really how broad workplace violence is. So it was, once we got the key stakeholders together, it just naturally came together as a policy.
And when you're saying the key stakeholders, my understanding is within your organization, it was security, human resource, and legal. Were there other entities involved in that?
Yes, employee relations was involved with that. Also, we involved safety is something different than security in our organization. So we also had people from the safety team participate that are focused on that. And even our residents facility folks. As we design future facilities, we need to look at workplace violence and how do we handle this, and what security measures we can put in place that maybe will enhance our ability to mitigate this.
Good point. Anything further around the components? I know this slide talks through the various elements that Aetna utilized. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I just didn't know if you had anything else to add that could be insightful for individuals who are participating in this. I think Aetna is a great example because you have a various divisions that were involved in this. But what I want to also make note of for smaller employers, you can with a couple of individuals within your organization utilize the templates, utilize guidance from CCADV to develop policy that fits your organization. I think Aetna really thought through what fits for Aetna, but for a smaller business or mid-sized organization, you can also think what fits for our organization. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think a couple key pieces of any policy. The first bullet here is really kind of define what is unacceptable behavior. What will the company allow and not allow, and that way it's very clear. I think another key piece is encouraging prompt reporting. You want to, kind of using the firefighter analogy, you want to get there early to be able to address all the different issues. The more that it lingers, the more complicated the issue gets. Also, multiple avenues of reporting. It might come through security. Here's the numbers to contact security. If you have a hotline with human resources, to make sure that number's out there. So it can come through, multiple different channels to get there. I think another key piece of this is making a commitment to non-retaliation. Meaning, if the employees in all good faith think this is going on, they should be encouraged to report it, and there's no retaliation for that because people are afraid to come forward.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, and I know you and I had spoken previously about the circumstance. Let's say someone who is an employee has a restraining order, has been successfully applied for and received a restraining order against their partner. And or maybe their partner was arrested on a domestic violence charge and there's a protective order in place. That is something, while it might feel there's a stigma where they might feel embarrassed having that conversation with your employer, in fact, it's really helpful as an employer to have that information, and for the security folks to be aware, or other individuals in the organization to be aware. And for some victims of domestic violence, you can, when you apply for the order, you can name your place of employment as additionally protected. So it might be your home, it might be your place of work, it may even be a family member's home. But those are things that I think are helpful when you create that culture where someone feels comfortable having that conversation.
So I can't overemphasize how important that is really making security and maybe HR aware that there's a protective order that's been issued. We go one step further. My investigators and investigative services actually will help the employee through the process because it's a little overwhelming if you've never gone through it. I'm fortunate that most of my investigators are former law enforcement and know how to kind of navigate through that system, the various systems. As you mentioned, that we encourage them to list the workplace as a protected area. And why that's so important, if you do have a stalking behavior by the spouse and they show up on the property, if it is a protected area, the probable cause has already been established. They violated the probable cause for the protective order, and it kind of makes it easier for the responding police officers how to handle the situation. So it kind of moves the process a little bit further down the road. So I can't overemphasize how important this piece of it is. It's not a requirement in our policy. It's just strongly encouraged, and we've had a lot of success stories because of this.
Yeah, and I think that I like the strongly encouraged, and I also think because at Aetna you've created a culture where employees can feel comfortable having that conversation. They're not fearful they're going to lose their job necessarily, that it just really speaks to an overall supportive environment. Which brings us to our next slide, where it is a real concern, I think, for victims of domestic violence that they're fearful of losing their job. It's their income, which is enormously important to them. It's their identity for many individuals, and it's that work is gives them a lot of confidence often and self-esteem. And so when Sean was referring earlier to the non-discrimination, non-retaliation piece in the policy that outlines how someone, when they or if they choose to talk to their employer, that they will not be retaliated against. It also outlines the opportunity for leave and other reasonable accommodations, which quite honestly employers have in place anyway. So it's really not that the domestic violence victim who is an employee would be receiving an additional entitlement necessarily. It's just making sure that if someone needs to, for example, as you were referring to earlier, meet with a domestic violence advocate and or apply for a restraining order, or they have to take time off for a hearing or something like that, that they feel comfortable doing that. And then the additional piece is the confidentiality, knowing that your employer is not going to, within the extent allowable by law and their own policies, keep this information confidential. And then here's the other piece that is important to acknowledge as well, that there will be, in all likelihood, individuals working within organizations who are abusive and who have abusive behaviors. And if you're abusive to your partner, chances are that sort of angry, violent, harassing behavior can yield itself also at work. Having said that, I'll also say that abusive partners can be very, very charming and manipulative, and so it's not always evident that when someone is being abusive to their partner, they may actually, in their outside world, have a very different persona. But there are times when someone who is working is the respondent of a restraining order. And it's really important for an organization to have some policies in place around what does that mean? What is our reaction? I'll give an example also of within our own work that we do. There was an individual who was in charge of student conduct at a state university here in Connecticut. He had been coming to the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence with his counterparts from across the state, working on college campus responses to domestic and sexual violence. And he was very well received and respected, and was a real important voice at the table. And he was surprisingly, here in our own world, we didn't see these signs, was arrested for strangling his wife. And which is a really concerning circumstance. The president of that university took action and reacted and said, this is an unacceptable behavior. This individual was put on leave. They pursued an investigation. And so that type of response, I think, can be important, and it can be important for individuals working to know that their organization is going to take action if they have these types of concerns. And so policy is, resources are available to develop policy, and they can be found on the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence website, where there's a toolkit, there are resources. What we will say is our staff are very happy to come work with your organization to offer any form of guidance around these policies. And then additionally, important components of policies are training and education. So at no cost to any employer, the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence is very wanting and willing to come to your organization and do training and offer education to perhaps key individuals in human resources, security, managers who might be in a position where they are interacting with employees in these circumstances. And then there's the awareness piece. Some organizations select during the month of October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, to have a company-wide or an office-wide awareness day to just create better understandings around this issue, resources for help. And so we find those various initiatives to be impactful. We're happy to work with organizations on them, or perhaps your local domestic violence organization would like to do that as well. It's really important and as part of this whole policy process for either large employers, smaller employers, to know who the local domestic violence provider is in your region, to know that they can be accessed at any time. It's a 24/7 network. And there are unique competencies that a domestic violence advocate has that can be really helpful to the victim. So it's sort of a combination or a collaboration between the employer and the advocate to be helping that individual and creating a supportive culture.
And the only thing I wanted to add to this is that a lot of businesses, companies have their own in-house training, and we certainly do too. A success story is that we partner with business continuity. We call it business resiliency. And they go out to the field every quarter and do testing to see if the business is prepared for any type of event that would have a business impact. Part of their training now, or when they go out, their exercise when they go out, they actually talk about workplace violence. By partnering with them, we're able to get the message out. They share some of the resources. So sometimes it's just really kind of thinking outside the box and trying to figure out how you can get the message out. So that's been really successful. We've done a lot more active shooter type stuff because of that, the interest. So I think it's been a really successful story of partnering up with another facet of the business.
Here's just some examples to show how this is achievable. I think often, again, there's hesitancy with employers around how do we even begin to create policy within our workplace? And there's different levels of policy, so it can really go across the spectrum. Aetna, I think, is the shining star example of the work that you're doing and the training that's occurring within your organization and the existence of policy. Bank of America also prioritizes domestic violence as a critical issue. It's their area of philanthropy, and then they have a lot of awareness events and also policy in the workplace. We were really pleased that in March of 2019, Governor Ned Lamont, through an executive order, bolstered the state's current family violence leave policy to include language around domestic violence and enhance responses on the part of the state of Connecticut if you are an employee, and we're talking about thousands of people, without creating additional entitlements for people. It's important for employers to know there are laws in the state of Connecticut, and we do have a policy division here at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So if there were questions around various laws related to domestic violence, here are some of the statutes, but we just wanted to be sure for individuals listening to this to know that information on these laws can be obtained either through legal resources within your organization. They are listed on the state's website. And then if you wanted additional information, we certainly at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence can offer that. It's also helpful, I think, for employers to know that help is available 24/7 wherever your business organization is located, and or if you have satellite offices. There are domestic violence organizations regionally located. There are 18 sites. They are all employing certified domestic violence advocates who have various competencies. And really importantly, also, they have confidentiality. And so that's really critical and important to a domestic violence victim or survivor to know that their conversation is protected. And that's where a domestic violence advocate can be helpful. They can be a connection for an employer if someone who works in your organization would like to try to apply for a restraining order. That advocate can be there with them in court, can help them apply for that order. If there's an arrest on a domestic violence charge, that advocate can keep the individual informed of the process, what's happening on the offender side. They work very closely with family relations so that the victim has information about what's happening with that person's case, whether they're participating in some type of an offender program, and they can be there for counseling and support for children. We also do a lot of work around what we call risk or lethality assessment to really know that there's evidence behind some critical things related to domestic violence, and advocates are trained on risk assessment as well. So it's important for employers to know we're here to be helpful, to be a resource, and happy to be involved. I just spoke about the various supports. One other piece is housing. So we have shelters, but we also have a new project where we have resources for something called rapid rehousing. So if there's an arrest on a family violence charge, and let's say your employee is needing to leave their residence because he is on the lease and she is not, for example, we have something called rapid rehousing available, which is up to 2 years of rent and utilities specifically for victims of domestic violence through some federal funding. So there's lots of resources, and we just encourage you to consider and think through how a domestic violence organization can be a support and helpful, knowing that it's confidential, safe, and free of charge. Sean, as we end this, I just want to thank you so much for your leadership around this and for participating in this webinar. I think it gives an example to know that you can, you can do this. I often think if an organization the size of Aetna is able to achieve this, it's really a great example for others on how they can do this.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.